Across the last half-millennium, history has shown a recurring sequence that has toppled three dominant world powers. What's alarming today is that the United States is now moving through that same sequence almost step by step, as if following a script written centuries ago. These stages aren't random. They're predictable markers that every collapsing superpower passed through. Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union all walked this road, thinking their strength was permanent. All three fell, and the US, whether it realizes it or not, is now deep in this trajectory. To understand how dangerous this pattern is, we need to look at the rise and fall of earlier empires. Spain in the late 1500s was unimaginably wealthy, controlling more gold and silver than any civilization before it. Britain in the early 1900s ran the largest empire ever assembled. The USSR wielded nuclear power and global influence unmatched by anything except America itself. Yet each of these giants collapsed, not from invasion but from internal unraveling that followed the same precise progression. Before diving into each empire's downfall, it's crucial to understand what imperial collapse truly looks like. It rarely begins with dramatic battles or foreign invasions. Instead, it starts quietly, beneath the surface in the numbers and decisions people ignore. It often begins with exhaustion, political, economic, and societal. An empire stretches its commitments farther than its resources allow, funding wars, bases, and promises it can't maintain. Everything still looks strong for a while, but the cracks widen under the surface. The early stages are almost invisible to ordinary people. Money still functions, institutions still operate, and governments still assure citizens that the future is secure. Yet the internal structure slowly weakens. Productivity declines, debt grows, and leadership becomes detached from reality. Eventually, the system begins accelerating toward failure. Allies grow uneasy, competitors test boundaries, and once stable foundations begin shaking. This hidden deterioration has happened to every empire at the height of its power, and each believed it could manage the danger, until it couldn't. Let's go back to the world's first true global superpower, Spain, during the 1500s and early 1600s. When precious metals from the Americas began flooding into Spanish ports, the empire enjoyed a level of wealth unmatched in European history. By controlling an enormous portion of the world's silver supply, Spain essentially controlled the money system of Europe. Their coinage became the universal trade currency, and people assumed this dominance would last indefinitely. That illusion set the stage for their downfall. Under King Philip II, Spain expanded aggressively, pouring resources into wars across multiple continents. Conflicts stretched from the Mediterranean to the Netherlands, from the Philippines to the Americas, and from England's seas to Italy's borders. No matter where tension erupted, Spain felt obligated to intervene. Nearly half of their national income went straight into maintaining this enormous military machine. The empire's leaders believed vast wealth could sustain endless warfare. Instead, overextension drained them faster than anyone expected. When tax revenues couldn't cover the skyrocketing costs of empire, Spain turned to the most common escape route: currency manipulation. Silver coins, once pure, were mixed with increasing amounts of copper, allowing the crown to create more money than it actually possessed. The symbolic value on the coin stayed the same, but its real worth shrank dramatically. As merchants realized the metal had been diluted, confidence collapsed. Every empire that debases its currency faces the same outcome: rising inflation and falling trust. As the money weakened, borrowing replaced solvency. Spain took loans from bankers across Europe. Italian, German, and Flemish lenders funded Spain's imperial ambitions. But constant borrowing quickly spiraled out of control. Spain declared bankruptcy multiple times within a single generation. Each default shook the financial system of Europe, yet the crown kept borrowing, believing new silver shipments would fix everything. Silver bought time but not stability. The empire entered a debt trap from which it never escaped. Spain's economic engine collapsed for a deeper reason: easy money breeds stagnation. With gold and silver flowing freely, The nation no longer needed to produce goods or innovate. Why farm when imported grain was cheaper? Why manufacture textiles when foreign workshops made better ones? The noble class looked down on work. Foreign goods replaced domestic production, and the empire slowly hollowed out. Wealth came in and immediately flowed back out to pay for imports. Nothing durable remained. As production declined and financial chaos grew, society began to fracture. Crime surged, poverty spread through cities, and anyone skilled or ambitious left for more stable nations. Spain lost not only territory, but its creative and economic lifeblood. Provinces broke away, regional identities strengthened, and by the late 1600s, the once mighty Spanish Empire existed mostly in memory. Spain never regained its former position. It became a country known more for culture and tourism than power or global influence. Now leap forward 3 centuries to Britain. The empire celebrated for having a sun that never set. At the start of the 20th century, Britain commanded a quarter of the planet, governed hundreds of millions of people, and anchored global finance through the pound sterling. London was the center of world trade and investment. British leaders believed this dominance would endure for centuries. But just like Spain, the pattern had already begun working beneath the surface. Britain's first major stage was military overreach. Maintaining control over India, Africa, the Middle East, and countless islands demanded a global network of soldiers, fleets, and administrators. When World War I erupted, Britain faced a deadly choice: stay out and protect the empire, or enter the war and risk everything. They chose to fight. The financial cost was crushing. By the war's end, Britain was drowning in debt to the United States, marking a fundamental shift. The empire's creditor had become its borrower. After the war, Britain tried desperately to maintain the illusion of financial strength. The pound had been backed by gold, but wartime spending had drained the reserves. Instead of adjusting its exchange rate, Britain returned to the pre-war gold value, artificially inflating the currency. This forced interest rates up, strangled domestic industries, and pushed unemployment to devastating levels. In 1931, the illusion finally broke. The pound fell off the gold standard, losing a quarter of its value in a single moment. Debt continued mounting as global instability worsened. When World War II erupted, Britain again threw itself into conflict, borrowing even more heavily from America and Canada. Victory came, but the price was catastrophic. By the end of the war, Britain owed more money than it could ever repay. Despite winning militarily, it had destroyed its economic foundations. The empire simply couldn't survive with empty finances, a weakened currency, and an exhausted population. The loss of empire happened quickly. India, the crown jewel of British rule, gained independence in 1947. Within 2 decades, nearly every major colony, across Africa, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, broke away. Britain transitioned from ruling a global network to managing an island nation with shrinking influence. The pound continued declining, and while Britain retained symbolic power, like a UN Security Council seat, it became clear to the world that the empire was permanently gone. Now consider the Soviet Union, the most recent superpower to meet the same fate. After World War II, the USSR emerged as America's only real rival. It held enormous territory, nuclear capabilities, and ideological influence across multiple continents. But the foundation beneath this power was brittle. The Soviet economy lacked flexibility, innovation, and incentive. Leaders believed centralized planning could sustain global competition forever. In reality, the system was already beginning to suffocate itself. Military spending consumed an extraordinary portion of Soviet resources. Matching American technology required a huge share of national income, even though the Soviet economy was far smaller. Supporting allies like Cuba, Vietnam, Syria, and others drained additional funds. The invasion of Afghanistan became a long, costly quagmire similar to America's later struggles. The Soviet machine looked powerful on the outside, but internally it was bleeding out, kept afloat only by oil revenue and propaganda. By the 1970s, the Soviet economy had stopped growing meaningfully. Factories produced outdated, low-quality goods. Agriculture collapsed so badly that a nation with some of the world's richest farmland ended up importing grain. Technological innovation lagged decades behind the West. The system punished initiative and rewarded compliance, ensuring that productivity withered. Without growth, the military burden became unsustainable, and life for ordinary citizens worsened steadily. The Soviet currency, the ruble, wasn't trusted even inside the USSR. It couldn't be converted on global markets, and people preferred foreign currencies whenever they could get them. The government relied heavily on selling oil and gold to buy necessities from abroad. When oil prices dropped in the 1980s, Soviet reserves began evaporating. Without hard currency, the internal economy crumbled. Shortages spread, confidence evaporated, and the perception of Soviet invincibility collapsed. By the late 1980s, the empire began to break apart. Eastern European satellite states cut ties almost overnight after the fall of the Berlin Wall. One after another, former Soviet-backed governments collapsed or shifted allegiances. The USSR no longer had the money, strength, or legitimacy to intervene. What had looked like a permanent superpower lost its geopolitical buffer zones within a single year. Without these, the Union's internal weaknesses accelerated dramatically. In 1991, the Soviet Union died abruptly. No enemy invaded. No foreign army marched into Moscow. The collapse came from within: economic implosion, institutional paralysis, and societal exhaustion. The ruble became worthless, the government lost control, and republics declared independence. A nation once armed with tens of thousands of nuclear weapons dissolved in less than 3 years. It was the most dramatic example of how quickly a superpower can vanish once the core stages of collapse are complete. With these 3 historical examples laid out, we can now examine the nation currently moving through the same sequence: the United States. For decades, America has maintained the largest military presence in history, with bases scattered across the world and commitments stretching across continents. Yet strength on paper can be misleading. The American system is showing the same internal stresses that destroyed earlier superpowers, and the stages align almost perfectly with the historical pattern. The first stage America completed is military overextension. With more than 700 bases located in 80 countries and troops stationed in well over 100 nations, the burden is immense. The U.S. has promised protection to Europe, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and other regions simultaneously. If multiple crises erupted at once, such as tensions in Taiwan, Eastern Europe, or the Middle East, America could not respond to all of them effectively. The military machine is overstretched, just like previous empires. The second stage is currency debasement. When the gold standard ended in the early 1970s, the dollar became a purely fiat currency, limited only by political decisions. Since then, the money supply has expanded dramatically, with an enormous surge in recent years. The purchasing power of the dollar has eroded nearly completely since the mid-20th century. Instead of mixing metals in coins as older nations did, America simply prints more currency digitally. The outcome, however, follows the same destructive trajectory. The third stage is the debt spiral. The United States owes a staggering amount, tens of trillions, exceeding its entire economic output. More concerning is the speed at which this debt is increasing. Interest payments alone are now comparable to major federal programs and approach the size of the entire defense budget. The government borrows money not only for new spending, but to pay interest on past borrowing. This is mathematically unsustainable and mirrors the exact path Spain and Britain took. Stage 4 is the erosion of productive capacity. The American economy has shifted heavily from manufacturing to consumption and services. Factories closed, supply chains were outsourced, and essential industries now rely on foreign production. The nation imports far more than it exports, everything from electronics and machinery to medicine and steel. This uneven dependence mirrors Spain's reliance on imported goods during its decline, when wealth flowed out faster than it came in. When an empire stops producing, its underlying strength fades quickly. Stage 5, which the United States is deeply immersed in, is social decay. Trust in institutions has fallen to historic lows, and major cities struggle with rising homelessness, drug addiction, and fragmentation. The population is divided politically, economically, and culturally. Birth rates are dropping, and overall national unity is weakening. Many of the brightest minds relocate abroad or disengage from public life entirely. This breakdown resembles the internal unraveling seen in late Spain, late Britain, and the final Soviet years. What follows next, Stage 6, is the loss of reserve currency status. This is the turning point where decline accelerates dramatically. When the world begins shifting away from a dominant currency, the issuing nation loses its ability to borrow cheaply, finance global ambitions, and maintain credibility. Early indications are already visible: major nations forming alternative economic blocs, international trade agreements denominated in currencies other than the dollar, and global powers increasing their gold reserves. These signals reflect the beginning of a major shift. If Stage 6 fully unfolds, Stage 7 arrives: swiftly collapse. Not a slow, gentle decline, but a rapid contraction of power, similar to what happened to the Soviet Union. When debt becomes unpayable, currency loses trust, and global obligations can no longer be met, systems break quickly. The illusion of stability persists until the financial structure suddenly gives way. A crisis in the dollar, followed by political chaos and economic disintegration, could transform the U.S. almost overnight. The pattern is unmistakable. Spain believed its silver would last forever. Britain assumed its empire was unshakable. The Soviet Union trusted its ideology and military superiority. Each thought it was unique, immune to the forces that bent past civilizations. The United States now repeats their assumptions, claiming technological advancement and global influence will shield it from consequences. But historical cycles don't adjust for pride or national myth. They follow mathematical and economic realities that apply universally. No empire has survived long-term currency debasement, rising debt, weakening production, and societal fragmentation, not one. These factors always converge into the same sequence, regardless of time period or region. America is already 5 stages in, with the foundation weakening rapidly. Whether collapse comes in 10 years, 5 years, or sooner cannot be predicted exactly. But the pattern gives us a clear direction, and every sign suggests we are approaching the final phases more quickly than expected. Some people hope that reforms, innovation, or political change might reverse the decline. And while nations can sometimes buy themselves time, no recorded empire has escaped the consequences once stages 1 through 5 were completed. Spain tried reform after reform. Britain attempted austerity and negotiation, and the Soviet Union tried restructuring. But once momentum shifts toward decline, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to reverse. The structural damage is too deep, and the global balance has already shifted. America still has strengths, large markets, technological leadership, and global alliances, but none of these can overcome fundamental economic laws. You cannot endlessly borrow, print, and spend without eroding stability. You cannot maintain far-reaching commitments without a strong industrial backbone. And you cannot sustain societal strength when institutions are distrusted and divisions widen. These realities aren't political, they're mathematical. History doesn't rely on opinion, it relies on patterns that repeat with remarkable precision. We've reached the point where the remaining stages depend on external catalysts. A major geopolitical conflict, a global financial shock, or a failed bond auction could push the U.S. into Stage 6 rapidly. The world doesn't need to abandon the dollar entirely, only begin reducing reliance. Once confidence starts slipping, the reversal becomes self-reinforcing. Nations diversify, investors panic, and the financial system reacts violently. This is how reserve currencies fall, and it's rarely a slow process. The concern isn't just economic. Political consequences accompany a currency crisis. Governments lose stability, public trust evaporates, and factions grow more extreme. Historically, collapsing currencies are often followed by leadership crises, social unrest, and institutional paralysis. America already shows early symptoms of these pressures: gridlock, polarization, distrust, and competing narratives about national identity. These fractures become far more dangerous when combined with financial instability. When collapse happens, it always feels sudden to the people living through it, even though the underlying decay has been visible for years. Spain's decline seemed abrupt when silver shipments slowed. Britain's empire looked stable until its debts became unmanageable. The Soviet Union appeared strong just months before dissolving. Collapse is not an event. It is the culmination of trends ignored for too long. The United States is now approaching that invisible tipping point. This script isn't meant to predict doom for dramatic effect. It's meant to show how repeating patterns across centuries reveal predictable outcomes. When multiple empires follow identical stages and reach the same conclusion, we should pay attention. The warning signs are not subtle. They're flashing brightly across every sector of American society. And the sooner these signs are acknowledged, the better chance there is to soften the impact or prepare for what comes next. The uncomfortable reality is that most nations don't correct course in time. Leaders avoid painful decisions, citizens resist sacrifice, and institutions prioritize short-term gains over long-term survival. This is exactly what Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union all did. The United States is now demonstrating similar tendencies, deferring responsibility, expanding commitments, printing money, and assuming stability will continue indefinitely simply because it always has. But history punishes that kind of complacency. If there is hope, it lies in awareness. Understanding where America stands in the sequence allows people to prepare, adapt, and protect themselves before the most severe stages unfold. Empires fall, but individuals and communities can still thrive if they see the pattern early. History may be repeating, but knowledge offers a chance, not to stop the cycle entirely, but to navigate it intelligently. As we move closer to stage 6 and 7, having a clear picture of the forces at work becomes essential. This pattern isn't hidden or mysterious. It's documented across 5 centuries. America followed the same steps the previous empires took, believing exceptionalism would keep the consequences away. But the sequence doesn't bend for optimism. It follows arithmetic, debt, and declining productivity. Understanding this gives you the ability to anticipate what is coming, not after the collapse, but before it arrives.